This lecture is on Aztec poets and their poetry. It will cover these three things. First, vocabulary words in Nahuatl, and then the enormous archive of ethnohistoric sources, including dictionaries of the Nahuatl language. And in this section, I will briefly discuss contributions by prominent scholars. What we cover here will help tremendously in section 3. Then, section 2 is a brief introduction to Nahua poets and their poetry. We will see who the poets are and how they recorded their work. Last is a review of the extant corpus of Nahua songs and poems, and we'll read a few selections and analyze them too. Let's begin. First, let me talk to you about these 3 cities and the people who lived here. They formed what we know as the Triple Alliance, which forms after the Tepanec War that began in 1427 after King Tezozomoc's death, which caused a succession crisis. Tenochtitlan, which is modern-day Mexico City, is the Aztec capital. They call themselves Mexica, and they're also Nahuas, but all of them are Nahuas, because Nahuas refers to culture, especially language. They all spoke Nahuatl. And Tenochca derives from Tenochtitlan, so it's someone who is from or lives in Tenochtitlan. Texcoco, which is sometimes spelled with a Z instead of an X, which is east of Tenochtitlan, and I'll show you in a map where each of them are. The people who lived in Texcoco are called Acolhuaque. And then we have Tlacopan, which is modern-day Tacuba. The people of Tlacopan and its environ are Tepanec. And here's a map attributed to Hernan Cortes showing Tenochtitlan. As you can see, this is the center of the city with causeways, and it shows a spectacular setting for the city. It was built basically on this Lake Texcoco. And here are the cities I was just talking about. Tenochtitlan is right here. This is a map we were just looking at. Here's Texcoco, and this is Tlacopan. These other cities are also very important. For example, Chalco, Xochimilco, Culhuacan, Azcapotzalco. Look at all these lakes. Lake Xochimilco, Lake Chalco, Lake Zumpango, Lake Xaltocan. And look, Teotihuacan is here. We'll talk a little bit about Teotihuacan, which was civilization that precedes the Aztecs. Now let's go over some vocabulary. You will see a lot of words in the rest of the lecture. So you will see Amatl or Amochtli referred to books. The Nahuas, before 1521, which is when the Spaniards arrived, had many libraries full of books. Calmecac, which are schools. Cihuatl means woman. Coatl, snake. Huicamatl is books of songs. Cuicatl is songs. Ehecatl is wind. Tlacuilo or Tlacuiloque, which is the plural, is a scribe or scribes. Tlamatini, those who were able to decipher what was recorded in books were sages. Tlamatini. Intlili Intlapali is literally the red and the black, but it's a metaphor for writing. Teotl is not necessarily God. Some people translate it as God. I don't do that because it's more like a concept of divinity. And then Xochitl appears again and again, and that means flower. Co is a locative suffix. That means it goes at the end of the word to denote place. For example, Texcoco, Azcapotzalco. In the poetry that we'll be reading, you will see a lot of words that remain untranslated. So when you see co, like this, or actually tlan, is another locative or relational suffix to denote place. For example, Aztlan, you know that those are cities or places. And then the suffix sin is a reverential title. Sometimes it's diminutive, like instead of saying Charles, you say Charlie, things like that. But it is actually a reverential added to the names of kings and queens, for example, or the nobility. You will hear a lot of names and a lot of chronicles. For example, Diego Muñoz Camargo, Fernando Alvarado de Sosomoc, Domingo Chimalpaín, Fernando de Alba Ixtlilxochitl, Juan Bautista Pomar. After 1521, when Spanish-led forces defeated the Aztecs in battle, the Aztecs did not disappear, of course, but they did lose hegemony in the region. The Aztecs, or the Nahuas, had been the most powerful state by the time Europeans arrived. And after 1521, scribes continued to train and to practice their art. Many of them took Spanish names because some of them were mestizos. For example, Juan Bautista Pomar, his mother was from the Texcoco nobility, but his father was a Spaniard. And then we have a lot of chronicles by anonymous indigenous scribes. They're extremely important. And that would be History of the Mexica through their paintings. And look how early it is, 1535. And then we have the Legend of the Suns and Annals of Huatitlan. And annals is a fancy word that means histories. Both of these are bounded into one single manuscript, Codex Chimalpopoca. And then we have Histoire du Mexique. It's a very interesting text. Then we have Anales de Tlatelolco. And I want to warn you that a lot of times these chronicles have several different names. And that is why I put also known as, so that when you're writing your papers or when you're reading articles, etc., you're not confused about what is what. And then there's Cantares Mexicanos, which has a huge corpus of the poems, some of which we're going to read. And then Historia Tolteca Chichimeca. One more thing is that the Aztecs did not develop a system of writing the way the Maya did. Nevertheless, they did write everything that was important to them in books and in other media, for example, mural painting, buildings, etc. And the last thing I'll say about this is that in 1521, the Nahua or the Aztec scribes began to learn European languages, including Spanish, Latin, Italian. They began to write chronicles. They wrote extensive histories. Romance de los Señores de Nueva España and Cantares Mexicanos are two of the biggest repositories of Nahua poetry. The rest of the chronicles that you see here help us to understand what the text in the poetry in Romances de los Señores de Nueva España and Cantares Mexicanos seeks to convey or means. Also useful in the study of Nahua poetry would be the Spanish or the European chroniclers. And we have many of them. One of the most important ones would be, of course, Fray Bernardino de Sahagún. He gathered information on the Nahuas by consulting with Nahua sages and commissioning Nahua scribes, or the Tlacuiloque, to work on making one of the most important works that we have on the Nahuas, and that would be the Florentine Codex. It's an encyclopedic work in 12 books. There's some Nahua poetry, as we will see, in the Florentine Codex. He also compiled another work that is very important and is different from the Florentine Codex, and that would be the Primeros Memoriales, also known as the Códices Matricienses, because they are in Madrid. They are housed in the Palacio Real del Patrimonio Nacional and the Real Academia de la Historia. This scholar, Francisco del Paso y Troncoso, in 1905, conducting research, he realized in these two places that there were two different manuscripts and realized that they're the same work. And then other names that I like you to be familiar with would be Motolinia, who was a Franciscan friar, and his name was Toribio de Benavente. Motolinia is a moniker that was given by the people of Tlaxcala because of his vow of poverty that led him to wear the same robe, and Motolinia means poor, so that everybody in the field knows him as Motolinia. And then there's Diego Duran, Juan de Torquemada, Jerónimo Mendieta. All of them are monks. There's Alonso de Zorita, who happens to have been a lawyer. I don't want you to feel that only friars or Catholic officials wrote these chronicles that helps us to understand Nahua poetry and all things Nahua. I just included here Hernán Cortés and Bernal Díaz del Castillo because they also wrote ample chronicles. And very important are these three dictionaries on the Mexican language, or Nahuatl. And the most important, the one that is most widely cited, would be the one by Alonso de Molina. This is an absolutely indispensable source for anyone studying the Aztecs. And then also Fray Andrés de Olmos, as you can see, it's a little bit earlier. He was one of the first friars, along with Motolinia, who arrived in Mexico in the 1520s. I also want to stress an important difference. In order to understand Nahua poetry and anything about the Aztecs, we have pre-contact screenfold manuscripts. These are different than colonial manuscripts in format, whereas pre-contact manuscripts are screenfolds, as you can see in this picture. Early colonial manuscripts are bound on the left side, books in the West. This is the traditional format. In addition, as you can see here, whereas pre-contact screenfolds refer information exclusively in images and calendar glyphs, early colonial ones have images and calendar glyphs, but they also include text. Sometimes the text would be little glosses here and there in the pictures, which is how the Aztec scribes sought to explain the story depicted in the images that only they could read. Other times, straight up, it just had a lot of text like this. And in fact, these chronicles a lot of times don't have images. For example, Historia de los Mexicanos por sus pinturas and Leyenda de los Soles, we know that these are completely made out of text. But when you read them, you see that they were transcribing what an Aztec sage or a Tramatini was reading from the picture books, the screenfolds. Unfortunately, of the many that were in existence in pre-contact times, only 5 from central Mexico survive. The Codex Bourbonicus is in the screenfold format, but some scholars think that is pre-contact and others think that is early colonial. And here are just a few examples of early colonial manuscripts. And last, I want you to also be familiar with a few names. These are prominent scholars of the Nahuatl language and the Nahua poetry and songs. One of the first scholars to publish Nahua poetry in the late 19th century would be Daniel Brinton, who named one of his publications Rigved Americanus. And that title just shows you how he felt about Nahua poetry. Rigved is literally praise and knowledge, and refers to the ancient corpus of Vedic Sanskrit hymns known as the Vedas. And another important name would be the German scholar Edward Seller. He was a prolific writer. He wrote books and books and books that are absolutely indispensable to anyone studying the Nahuas, and the Maya for that matter. In Francisco del Paso y Troncoso, he realized that the 2 manuscripts in Madrid together formed the Primeros Memoriales in the 1890s. He's a very influential scholar. He was the director of El Museo de Historia y Antropología in Mexico City, one of the most important museums in the world, with ample collections of pre-contact artworks from Mesoamerica. Ángel María Garibay, since the 1930s, had been publishing books on Nahua poetry. He provided translations and annotation. Another important author, a large portion of this lecture is actually based on his ideas, and that would be the Mexican anthropologist Miguel León Portilla, who in the 1960s changed our field because his dissertation was focused specifically on Nahua philosophy. And of course, he had to write about songs and poetry. And then we have John Beerhurst, whose contributions, especially in the translation and annotation of Nahuatl text, is invaluable. But he also proposed a theory that Nahua poems had been created in the colonial period when the Spaniards had arrived in Mesoamerica. And it's something that I myself and also Miguel León Portilla would not agree with. And you'll see in the lecture why. He thought that the ghost dance that indigenous peoples in North America, in what is today the United States, had developed in the colonial period to deal with the trauma that the conquest of European nations like Great Britain and France and Russia and all these countries coming in, he used that theory of the ghost dance and thought that the same applied to Mesoamerica. But you'll see that that is probably not the case. That is not the case, actually. Beerhurst acknowledged that his argument was, quote, no more than a theory. And then James Lockhart is also another scholar who has greatly contributed to our understanding of the Nahuatl language and what the Aztec poets were writing in their work. Okay, section 2. Brief introduction to Nahua poets and their poetry. Let's go see who the poets are and how they recorded their work. The vast majority of extant Nahua poetry is by anonymous authors. Nevertheless, the documents that survive clearly indicate or identify specific authors. And we know that members of the nobility engaged in this art of poetry were poets. For example, this king that you see here, his name was Nezahualcoyotl. He ruled Texcoco. He was what we would call a Renaissance man. He had many, many abilities. He was a statesman, a king, a warrior. As you can see in this image, he's dressed in the warrior attire, including holding weapons and a shield. An architect, a poet, and a philosopher. At the age of 16, Nezahualcoyotl saw his father being assassinated by Azcapotzalco warriors. And we know that from Chimalpain's chronicles. He said that this event happened in 1418. Later, he didn't know about this, but his grandson, Carlos Ometochtin, Lord of Texcoco, was burnt alive by the Spanish Inquisition on the 30th of November, 1539, because he was accused of rejecting Catholicism. Now, the themes in Nezahualcoyotl's poetry are awareness of time and change, the conviction that life is fleeting, and this perennial question among all humans, how to find the source of eternal life. Now, Miguel León Portilla's book, 15 Poets of the Aztec World, focuses on 15 poets. And I just want to illustrate to you a couple of things. Number one, that there were female poets. There were female authors. For example, Macuilxochitzin was from Mexico Tenochtitlan. She was the daughter of Tlacaelel. Let me show you. The second in command in the Aztec nation. He served under King Itzcoatl and then served after these four rulers. He actually made the Aztecs imperial, by the way. And then I put this list here for you from 15 poets of the Aztec world to show you that they were all Nahua poets, of course. They're all Aztec, but some of them were from the capital city, Mexico Tenochtitlan. Others were from Texcoco, or Tlaxcala, or Chalco Amaquemecan. And I put the name of the author or the poet and then the city. Oh, that's his full name. And that's the city. This should not be here. I just want to mention a couple of things here. First of all, the Spanish arrive in the 16th century. They defeat and take the hegemony away from the Aztecs in 1520. And it's erroneous to think that that's the end of the dynasties of Aztec kings and queens in Mexico. Because, as you can see from this chart that I've created, many more kings were established after 1520. A fun fact, the title of the second in command was officially Cihuacoatl, which literally means serpent woman. Some Spanish chroniclers, like Bernal Díaz el Castillo, for example, were sometimes horrorized that in the most solemn celebrations, that Cihuacoatl would come out dressed as a woman. And the second thing is that usually in textbooks, and this list includes all the kings, the Mexica or the Aztec established themselves in Mexico City around 1325, by the way, and Tenoch begins the line. One of the things that is missing and mostly missing in our textbooks is queens, female rulers. But I want to point out that Nahua women could be rulers too. Various sources say that Tenochtitlan actually was once ruled by a queen. And Chimalpain discusses them and says that they were known as Cihuatlatoque. For example, after Moctezuma's death, his daughter Atotoztli became Tenochtitlan's ruler, although she disappeared from the historic record, and only her sons, for example, Axayacatl, appear. And then each of these female rulers ascended to the throne after their respective father's death. And that would be Azcapotzalco, ruler of Tepetlaostoc. Her rulership is discussed in Codex and Cruz. Then there's Omotochtin, ruler of Tepechpan. And Tira de Tepechpan discusses her. And also, like I just said, Atotoztli ruled Tenochtitlan. This fact appears in various sources, including Memoriales by Motolinia. So why erase from dynastic lines? We're not exactly sure. Some scholars think that perhaps colonialism had a lot to do with it. And over here, just very quickly, Motolinia says, once Moctezuma the Elder died without a legitimate son to succeed him. A legitimate daughter succeeded him to the throne. And I should also mention that Aztec women could also become scribes. Here in the Codex Telluriano-Remensis, it says La Pintora, which is Spanish for female artist. And here she is with the glyph for painting or screen folds. And as we said in the last lecture, Mesoamericans inscribed, they recorded important information in screenfold manuscripts like this one. And look what Motolinia says about this. He says, these books were written in symbols and pictures. This was their way of writing, supplying their lack of an alphabet by the use of symbols. Some things pertaining to ancient times and the fixing of the succession of the lords who took possession of and ruled over this great land have been gathered and explained by their figures. They related in figures the achievement of victory and the conduct of wars, the succession of chief lords, weather conditions, signs in the heavens, and general epidemics, at what time and under which lord these things occurred. Now you may think, how is it that you could write poems or long histories with only symbols and pictures? For our generation right now in the 21st century, it may not be so difficult to understand writing with images, since we do that a lot. For example, here we have the symbol for infinity, copyright, stop, children crossing, no bikes, female, recycle, the poop emoji, robot, writing, or this notation actually from the Middle East. These are Arab numerals. Instead of having to write N-I-N-E for 9, you just write the symbol. And it's so much easier to do a computation like this, actually. Or even this one, which stands for DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, or the double helix. One thing I should mention is that one of the ways in which the Nahua conserved their poetry would be with music. It's so much easier to remember precise lines when you put this to song. Just think about the national anthem of any particular country. And the Aztecs had a long and rich tradition in music, and in poetry, of course. For example, they had different types of drums. They also had musical instruments, including wind, which they made with horns and trumpets, made with conch shells sometimes. But they had flutes and rattles as well. And here's another image of that drum, which is so exquisitely carved. Look at that. And over here I wrote the symbols that are so exquisitely carved in this drum. And this is a page from the Florentine Codex, the encyclopedia that we've been talking about. And it just shows how the Nahua carpenters worked the wood to make the works of art. Nahua poetry and song survives because they bequeathed it orally, and that's called oral history. But also they recorded them in manuscripts and other material culture. I would like to stress the fact that oral history has been longer with human beings than written history. Greek theater, literature, philosophy was bequeathed orally for hundreds of years. Same with the Bible in the Jewish tradition of the Hebrews. So the fact that Mesoamerica had an oral tradition shouldn't be a shock to anybody. And we should just as easily comprehend it as we comprehend the fact that the Hebrew Bible, the compilation of books, was actually passed along from generation to generation exclusively via oral tradition. The same goes for Greek theater, philosophy, and other works. And regarding how Nahua poetry was bequeathed from generation to generation, look at what a native scribe, Alvarado Tesosomoc, in Crónica Mexicayotl said. The ancient men and women, our fathers, our mothers, told them, repeated them, had them painted for us, also in their books. So not only do they repeat them, which is key to learning something by heart, they also painted them, so they would have mnemonic devices in books as well. Sahagún echoes these ideas as well, because he said, all those things about which we, so he's talking about him and the old native informants, conferred, they gave me by means of their paintings, which is the writing they had in their ancient times. After 21, as I was just saying, a lot of chronicles express how fast the Nahua scribes learned. And look what Botolinia says about Nahua scribes learning a new way of recording information. He says that the Nahua painter scribes learned to read rapidly a Romance Castilian language, as well as Latin in script and print. Writing they learned in a short period of time, in a few days after they were writing, and they could imitate the material placed before them or the penmanship of their teacher. And he also says, bedecked in feathers and with a bouquet of roses in their hands, the Indian lords and chiefs perform a dance and sing in their language the songs, the solemnize, the feast which they are celebrating. The friars have translated these songs for them, and the Indian masters have put them into the meter to which the Indians are accustomed. The songs are graceful and harmonious. And over here, both from the Florentine Codex, this from book 3, shows Aztec musicians. And these glyphs emitting from their mouth, that means speech. And over here you see a singer, and it's very thought-provoking that the glyphs are surrounding the book itself, not emitting from his mouth as per usual. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the fact that friars work together in collaboration with Aztec scribes. There's a lot of emphasis placed on this notion that the Aztecs were learning from Europeans only. And look what Alonso de Zorita said about recording ideas in manuscripts. The principal Indians preserved them, and he, Olmos, you'll remember he was a friar, asked them to commit them to writing, and did it so without his being present, and took the texts from their paintings, which is like their own script, and that they understand themselves well by means of them, and that nothing was changed, but a division by paragraphs was introduced. And last, I want to read these 2 quotes from one of my favorite, Diego Duran. He wrote many books on the Nahua. Diego Duran lamented so much the fact that the Spaniards had burned so many books, because he said now it's like we don't know what they're singing, and we wish we knew, because then we can make them better Christians if we understood what is it that they're singing. The friars wanted to help the Nahua associate their ancient costumes to Catholicism. So this is what Fray Diego Duran writes. I questioned an Indian advanced in years from Coatepec, who was considered a wise man in his town. This man, soon after, died of the Great Plague. I begged him to tell me whether what was written and painted there was true, but the Indians find it difficult to give explanations unless they can consult the book of their village. So he went to his home and brought back a painted manuscript, but the characters impressed me more as representations of magical things than history. One of the things that I love about Duran's work is that he commits it to writing even when he doesn't understand. He writes his mind. For example, it's almost humorous that he says that Indians find it difficult to give explanation unless they can consult the book of their village. So whenever they were asked a difficult question, a philosophical question, they always wanted to bring the book. And there's many instances in the chroniclers in which Spanish friars are always amazed at how the Nahuas had fierce discussions about any one particular issue that was asked. Duran is saying that the characters impressed him as magical things instead of history. And that just goes to show you that Diego Duran was so accustomed to Latin script for recording things. So it's not shocking to imagine how difficult it must have been for him to believe that images and calendar glyphs could express complex ideas. Duran says also of poems and songs, I have heard those songs many times in dances at the open air, which gave me much contentment. By the way, Diego Duran came to Mexico at the age of 5 approximately. He said that it is in Mexico that he lost his baby teeth. And so he was very much a Catholic, but he was also a lover of all things Nahua. And now, to close the lecture, let's review a few poems. This is the corpus of Nahua poetry or songs. As I said, scholars have found that they appear in these 4 places, in these 4 collections. Number 1, we have 20 sacred hymns, or Teocuicatl. From the brief Nahua introduction to basic vocabulary, you will remember that teotl, here shortened with teo, means divine or sacred, and cuicatl is song. So sacred songs. These songs are usually to a divinity, like to Quetzalcoatl, let's say, or to the rain god. Then we have the Huehuetlatoli, which is the speeches of the elder. And Huehue is ancient or elder or old, very old. And Tlatoli are the speeches. So these are the speeches of the ancients. We find these scattered in various manuscripts. I will show you a selection right now. So this pertains to songs that have been passed along from generation to generation. Perhaps they're Toltec in origin, or even from Teotihuacan, which is even older. And then there's this collection in a manuscript called Cantares Mexicanos, another one that is compiled into one tome or one manuscript called Romances de los Señores de Nueva España. Let's have a look. The 20 sacred hymns, Teocuicatl, were compiled from 1558 to 1560 by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and native informants, people who helped Sahagún gather information from Tepepulco. And I like to stress the fact that the Nahuas had a rich tradition of recording information in books and in other media way before the Europeans arrived. Consequently, as Lockhart has said, the fact that the Spaniards brought books with them did not impress or bewilder the Aztecs, who had a tradition of making books and recording information in them for hundreds of years already. These sacred hymns are written in Nahuatl. They're not translated into Spanish except for glosses or certain words in primeros memoriales, also known as códices matritenses. The Florentine Codex include a commentary by Sahagún in which he states that Teocuicatl are an obscure forest invented by the demon to be employed in his service. And I should say that a lot of times I wonder whether it was frustration, the way that Spaniards, specifically friars, would equate Nahua divinity with demon and sin. And perhaps I'm being too apologetic if I say that on some level, I think that they tried to insert that because the Inquisition, they did not want to get in trouble, but they were very curious to record as much as they could on the Nahuas. If we are interested in the Nahuas, imagine what the Spanish friars, whose whole life was devoted to the study of scriptures, how enticing the Nahua must have seemed to them. And on some level, they're also very obscure. Remember what I said about Duran, in which he says that any questions you ask them, they must consult with all the sages, begin this deliberation. And that's what happens when you're discussing serious things about philosophy, about history, the law, etc. When you're dealing with things like that, things don't necessarily have a black and white answer. Let me show you an example of what Sahagún called an obscure forest. Let's read this Song of the Warrior in the South House. O my chieftain in the spear house, this is not the name to which I give ear. When they heap abuse upon me, then do I not know that I am the unearthly one? Then do I not know that I am the warrior? When they say, my chieftain in the spear house, they slander my kingly descent. The leader of the young men, the chieftain in the Toquilan, he has done the eagle robe, which is trimmed at different places with points. Oh, the young warrior in the Olopan, my captive is covered with feathers. Already I render myself feared. Already I render myself feared. My captive is covered with feathers. Oh, the young warrior in the Witsnawak, my captive is covered with feathers. Already I rendered myself feared. Already I rendered myself feared. My captive is covered with feathers. Oh, the young warrior in the Itzcuatlan, my captive is covered with feathers. Already I render myself feared. Already I render myself feared. My captive is covered with feathers. The priest in the Witsnawa, the distinction came down. Day has come. Day has come. The time of the sacrifice is at hand. The distinction came down. The priest in the Toquilan, the distinction came down. Day has come. Day has come. The time of the sacrifice is at hand. The distinction came down. If you were to write a paper about this poem, then you would probably agree with Sahagún's point about these poems being an obscure forest. And even though at first it might be very difficult to understand, I'd like to point out a few tactics that you could use to analyze these. I would suggest that you seek these sources that I explained at the beginning of the lecture. For example, I took this translation from Edward Seller's article, and in it he provides the Nahuatl version. In the Nahuatl, the warrior in the South Temple is Wisnahuac Yaotl. And we know that Yaotl is another name for Tezcatlipoca, smoking mirror. And the Nahuatl will also show you that the spear house in the North Temple in the Nahuatl is Tlacochcalco, which is in the spear house. So now we have some clues because the focus is on the warrior and is emphasizing Tezcatlipoca, and one of his salient iconographic features would be flint knives. That would be the references to spear and even to points. And look what this introductory paragraph says. He's saying that this is not the name to which he pays close attention. Is he talking about Tezcatlipoca or the place? And neither the South nor the North are necessarily the most desirable places. These are mostly associated with death and cold. And at first, the warrior is talking about abuse, slander. He's saying that slander my kingly descent, and descent refers to birth or being born. So kingly descent would be a birth befitting a king. Could this be the outlook of a warrior before entering the battlefield or preparing for war? At first, it's a little bit doubtful because it says, then do I not know that I am the unearthly one? And I wonder, unearthly one is supernatural or godly, like Tezcatlipoca. And then it asks, then do I not know that I am the warrior? Is this a little bit of self-doubt? But then it turns to teachers, the leader of the young men, and then notice the focus on place. We have several temples. The North Temple, Toquilan, which is Warm Temple, Olopan, Huitznahuac, Itzcuatlan. So there's that emphasis on place. And then it says the chieftain in the Toquilan, he has donned the eagle robe. An eagle robe suggests a warrior class because in Nahua military, the eagles and the jaguars were two ranks in the military. And this particular robe is trimmed at different places with points. So that's probably suggesting flint knives. Then it focuses on the young warrior. It says that my captive is covered with feathers. And this is very important because Nahua warfare is very different from modern day practices. In modern times, soldiers go to war and they kill in the battlefield and leave the bodies there. Whereas for the Nahua, there was the emphasis of warriors taking alive a captive and dispatching that warrior captive at the temple. The more prestigious the captive, the more distinction that a Nahua warrior would attain. And the manner of killing a captive also at the temple would be a very important ceremony. It included covering or decorating the captive with feathers. One of the most famous examples would be that of Coyolxauhqui. She was a fierce Aztec warrior who fought valiantly against Huitzilopochtli, the main Aztec god, the sun god, even though ultimately Huitzilopochtli defeated her. But as you can see on her hair adorning it, these little circles are feather balls. And that is the decoration that a captive would have. Look at this image, where she was found in 1978, just so that you see the scale of the art piece. That suggests how important the image is. And here's another rendition of Coyolxauhqui as a captive of war. Her closed eye suggests that she's already dead. She's already been sacrificed. Over here you can see better the little circles that I was talking about. The feathers adorning her head in the front, in her bangs, but also in the back, as you can see here. In the underside, underneath the sculpture, is the symbol called Atl Tlachinoli, which is the symbol for warfare. You see the serpent here, but it's intertwined water and fire. So that is the feathers. And then it says, already I render myself feared. So there's a sense of change in here from the first few lines, because he says that already the warrior feels that he is feared, that he inspires or provokes fear in others. And then it repeats it, already I rendered myself feared, and then reiterates the idea of the captive who is covered with feathers. And then it repeats again for another sight and another. And then it says the priest Ida Wisnawa, he says the distinction came down. So what distinction, I wonder? And came down is a metaphor for being born, like I said. And then he has this beautiful metaphor of day has come, and that suggests the time of the sacrifice is at hand. And day has come, of course, refers to the sunrise. One of the things that the Nahua noticed, like everybody else in the world, is the marking of the passage of time that the sun does, with the sunrise and the sunset creating day and night. And so this is a reference to day has come. When the sun breaks, when dawn arrives, the distinction is born as well. And then that's reiterated again for another place. A few things that are useful when analyzing Nahua poems would be look at the translations in various sources that I introduced at the beginning of the lecture, including Edward Seller, Miguel León Portilla's translations, or John Beerhurst. That's an excellent start. And another useful thing would be to conduct a little bit of research. Look in textbooks and read a little bit about Aztec warriors and what they were all about and the symbology. And you would understand some of the themes that I already explained are evoked in this poem. And last, a fun yet difficult endeavor would be for you to use the vocabularies, for example, the Molina vocabulary, again, that I introduced at the beginning of the lecture, and see if you agree with a translation that a particular scholar made. And you can look up individual words. And all of that can bring us to a better understanding of these poems. The other thing that I would suggest is that you begin to ask questions that can be thought-provoking. For example, what stands out to me is a lack of references to weapons other than the spears that could suggest flint knives. But if this is the song of the warrior in the house of Tezcatlipoca, one of the most important creator gods for the Nahuas, is this song about determination and focus? It would be very interesting to analyze this poem in the context of, for example, this idea of balance provided by the different localities, specific temples, or stability, or even strength. It may seem cautious at first, but this phrase, they slander my kingly descent, this is a warrior who stands comfortable in his own strength. It's important to keep in mind that this poetry and these songs were so important to the Nahua that even in 1583, look at what Sahagún, in the prologue to the Salmodia Cristiana, it's another work to proselytize or convert to Christianity. Sahagún explains that the Nahua want very much to sing again their old chants in their homes and communal houses, which he suggests makes the sincerity of their Christian faith suspicious because in their old songs, for the most part, they evoke idolatrous things in a style so obscure that nobody can understand. This is very impressive because the conquest is in the 1520s. 60 plus years later, here we are, the Nahuas continue with their old traditions. The other corpus are the Huehuetlatoli, Song of the Elders. These are lyric chants and epic poems. A lot of them are based in history, attributed to ancient or legendary person or people, for example, the Toltec or the Teotihuacan people. And it's not a single corpus like cantares or romances, but they're written in various annals, including the Florentine Codex and Primeros Memoriales, Historia Tolteca Chichimeca, Unos Anales de la Nación Mexicana, Codex Chimalpopoca, which comprises Leyenda de los Soles and Anales de Cuautitlán, various other manuscripts and chroniclers. And here's just to show you a selection from the Florentine Codex, from Book 10. It says, first, those named the Tolteca, so-called, these first came to live here in the land called Land of the Mexica, Land of the Chichimeca, and for several 400 of years, they dwelt in the vicinity of Toltecatzingo. Since they really lived there, they left many of their traces which they had fashioned. In that area they made what was their temple. Its name was House of Beams. Today it stands. It exists, considering that it is indestructible, for it is of rock, of stone. The Tolteca were skilled. It is said that they were feather workers who glued feathers. And in this way were the Tolteca learned. They knew well, they understood well, that which pertained to herbs, to the nature of their essence, which ones were good, which esteemed, and which of them were just plants, which ones bad, evil, harmful, or really deadly. So learned were they that they were the ones who, for the first time, discovered, found, and for the first time used the green stones, fine turquoise, and then common obsidian too, all kinds of wondrous precious stones. And they understood the movement of the heavens, their orbits, they learned from the stars. I just took bits and pieces to show you how highly they thought of the Tolteca, and they write similar things about various groups of people that lived in Mesoamerica, in central Mexico specifically, before the rise of the Aztecs in 1325. It's interesting to note that the Aztecs are known for their artists who made exquisite featherworks. After the conquest, there was so much demand worldwide for them. And it's interesting to see that it's an ancient skill. And also the Nahua give credit to them too, understanding about plants and mining of precious stones, as well as astronomy. And look what Leon Portilla says. Archaeological evidence from various sites within the Teotihuacan metropolis leads one to affirm beyond any doubt that sacred chants were often intoned by the priests. The previously mentioned glyphic signs known as sound scrolls, emerging from the mouths of religious dignitaries that are visible in several Teotihuacan mural paintings and in tripod vessels, confirm it. Those priests were indeed intoning their hymns to propitiate the rain god or some other deity. Here's a mural painting from Teotihuacan, and look at the dating that shows priests with glyphs emitting from their mouth, and these glyphs are very much adorned and therefore signify songs and poetry besides merely plain speech. But these signify any type of utterance. And what Leon Portilla is trying to emphasize is the fact that it is not ludicrous to think that in Mesoamerica we have a very excellent oral tradition, and it is so effective because the Nahuas and their contemporaries in Mesoamerica were heirs to this venerable tradition in poetry. Let me say a little bit about Cantares Mexicanos. This is the largest collection, consists of 85 folios, and it's written in the front and in the back, except for the last page is blank, compiled by indigenous scribes, and they're written in Nahuatl, because even Nahuatl was written down in images and calendar glyphs, but starting after 1521, as already explained in this lecture, Nahua scribes learned to use alphabetic script to write Nahuatl. Sometimes some of the songs are Christianized with phrases like Santa Maria, Madre de Dios, and this is referring to the Virgin Mary. It literally means Holy Mary, Mother of God. And this was to avoid reproach or destruction of the manuscripts. Sometimes glosses and annotations state a pre-contact origin, and sometimes it reveals an author's name, and this is very significant. Some of the songs include names of persons, dates, all in the 1500s, and even explanations of how to recite them with musical accompaniment. And the cantares are composed in different genres, and they refer specific places and instruct use of very specific musical style. And right now they're conserved at the National Library of Mexico. I put here, based on Miguel León Portilla's scholarship in 15 poets, I wrote for you the places that are evoked in the poems and songs in the Cantares Mexicanos, and the genre. And look at that, it's songs of springtime, flowery songs, songs of birds, songs of fish, songs of orphanhood, necklace songs, songs of lords, songs of suffering, songs of eagles, songs of war, of pouring water, of women, of doves, provocative songs, old songs or songs of the elders. And then Leon Portilla also synthesizes for us the musical style or accompaniment that I listed here for easy reference. Let's read one. Begin the song in pleasure, singer, and joy. Give pleasure to all, even to life-giver. Delight, for life-giver adorns us. All the flower bracelets, your flowers are dancing. Our songs are strong in this jewel house, this golden house. The flower tree grows and shakes, already it scatters. The quetzal breathes honey, the golden flamingo breathes honey. You have transformed into a flower tree. You have emerged. You bend and scatter. You have appeared before God's face as multicolored flowers. Live here on earth, blossom. As you move and shake, flowers fall. My flowers are eternal. My songs are forever. I raise them. I, a singer. I scatter them. I spill them. The flowers become gold. They are carried inside the golden place. Flowers of raven, flowers you scatter. You let them fall in the house of flowers. Ah, yes, I am happy. I, Prince Nezahualcóyotl, gathering jewels, wide plumes of quetzal. I contemplate the faces of jades. They are the princes. I gaze into the faces of eagles and jaguars, and behold the faces of jades and jewels. We will pass away. I, Nezahualcóyotl, say, enjoy. Do we really live on earth? Not forever on earth, only a brief time here. Even jades fracture, even gold ruptures, even quetzal plumes tear. Not forever on earth, only a brief time here. What a beautiful poem. It kind of takes us through the whole circle of life because for the most part it's very joyous and beautiful. And then it concludes with an acknowledgement of our brief time on earth, but also realizing that even jade and gold, which are so strong, and the preciousness of quetzal plumes, even they tear. And last, Romances de los Señores de Nueva España consist of 114 folios bound with the Relación Geográfica de Texcoco in 1582 and compiled by Juan Bautista de Pomar. No other date other than 1582 is found in the Romances. And Bautista de Pomar divided the corpus into 4 parts, which leads us to think that this indicates that the work was compiled in 4 different stages. And references to places, styles, and or authors are not prevalent, as in the Cantares corpus. A few of the songs here, though, are found or repeated in cantares. And the only European influence seems to be the occasional Dios, which is God, and a few other Catholic references. And right now, Romances de los Señores de Nueva España are conserved at the Nettie Lee Benson Library at the University of Texas Library in Austin. And we'll end with this poem by Nezahualcóyotl, with whom we began. In vain was I born, in vain have I come forth to earth from the house of the Lord. I am sorely lacking. Would that I had not come forth. Truly better I had not come to earth. I cannot express it, but what must I do? Oh, princes who have come here, must I live in the sight of the people? How will it be? Reflect on it. Must I stand up straight on the earth? Which is my destiny? I am sorely lacking. My heart suffers. You are now my friend. Here on earth, how should one live beside the people? Works he, perhaps carelessly? He who is the people's sustainer, live peacefully, pass life calmly. I am bent over. I live with my head bowed beside the people. For this I am weeping. I am wretched. I have remained alone beside the people on earth. How has your heart decided, giver of life? Dismiss your pleasure. Extend your compassion. I am at your side. You are God. Perhaps you would bring death to me? Is it true that we are happy, that we live on the earth? It is not certain that we live and have come on earth to be happy. We are sorely lacking. Is there any who does not suffer here beside the people? Would that my heart be not afflicted. Do not reflect any more. Truly, I scarcely pity myself here on earth. Sorrow has sprung up near you and at your side, giver of life. Only I am searching. I remember our friends. Will they come once more? Perhaps they will live again. Only once we perish, only once here on the earth. Let not their hearts suffer, near at the side of the giver of life. As you will remember at the start of the lecture, I discussed particulars about the life of King Nezahualcoyotl and how at the tender age of 16 he witnessed his father's murder. So in this gorgeous poem, he's wondering, some of the philosophical questions that he raises are, why do I exist? And it's a little bit like a popular Mexican song that talks about how life is like a game in which we all must bet and there's no way around it. And over here, he may be thinking about how he wishes that he would not have been born. Here, he seems to be talking about the virtuous life. He's questioning whether God was careless, that he allows pain and suffering. And over here, does he live in community with his people? Or is he alone? I will end with this beautiful poem by King Nezahualcoyotl, hoping that you will read this song again and again and try to see how it moves you. Thank you for watching, and these are the works cited.